I'm not going to extend this review needlessly. I'm a fan of this new, highly customizable laptop line from Lenovo. It knows exactly where it is on the price spectrum and offers all the correct options, and it even sweetens the deal by offering a few features that are normally reserved for higher tier laptops. This is the Lenovo LOQ 15IRH8, and it's the evolution of the comfortably mid-range IdeaPad gaming series. And in this review, I'm going to show you exactly why, on the first boot up of this gaming laptop, I was already convinced that Lenovo took all the right steps in developing it. But before we continue with the video, let's keep the lights on here in the studio. This video is brought to you by Sneak Attack Design Lab. They're a clothing company that specializes in technical fashion, more commonly known as techwear, and you can see me in their clothes in most of my videos. I've been supporting their brand ever since I met them back in 2019, and now they're returning the favor. Head on over to this link, you can find it in the description as well, to get 10% off your order from their site. Check their clothes out, you're bound to see something badass over there that'll look great on you. Thank you very much to Sneak Attack for this exclusive promo for my viewers. Now, back to the video. Like with all my reviews, we start at the outside. The Lenovo LOQ 15IRH8 is a predominantly plastic laptop that has a metal top plate and cover. It feels somewhat ruggedized to an extent. The plastic body is sturdy and grippy, and the styling straddles the line between being shaped like a gaming device but utilizing much more tasteful tonal materials. It's like one of those Mustangs that don't have all them garish decals on it. It looks like a sports car, sure, but it doesn't advertise it as heavily. It measures 36 cm wide, 26 cm deep, and 2.5 cm tall, and weighs around 5.2 pounds on its own and a little bit over 6 pounds with the charger. It's big, it's somewhat heavy, but that is to be mostly expected with gaming laptops nowadays. Build quality is also what we normally see with Lenovo and Legion laptops. Nothing creaks on the body and the screen doesn't wobble when typing, and it flexes very little. It's built really well and I have no complaints about it. But overall, I can get behind the build of the LOQ 15IRH8. It is huge, it is moderately heavy, but I feel that it's a worthwhile tax to pay for a solidly built, albeit all plastic laptop. Moving on down to the keyboard and trackpad, it's fairly familiar territory. It basically has the same layout and keys as all of its brother and the higher tier Legion lineup, albeit with a few features stepped down. There is no per key RGB lighting, only a 3-zone option. There's also no fingerprint scanner. There's also some keyboard flex but not an alarming amount, and the huge trackpad is a nice transplant from the higher priced models in the Lenovo range. Unless you really have to have a per key RGB keyboard, there's nothing to be mad about here on the LOQ 15IRH8. Then there's the ports, and I swear Lenovo has its ports game down pat with the sheer amount of ports they put on each one of their laptops. Starting on the left side, we have a USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type-C port that supports DisplayPort 1.4 out and up to 140 watts of power delivery, a 40 watt step up from its previous generation brothers. And we also get a unified 3.5mm headphone and microphone jack. On the right side, we have a USB 3.2 Gen 1 Type-A port and the Webcam E shutter switch. This is pretty great since it's a hardware disconnect switch. And at the back, we get all the good stuff: the 170 watt reversible DC in, 2 USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type-A's, an HDMI 2.1, and the best one yet, an RJ45 Ethernet port. Great stuff. Well, Lenovo has been consistently great with the ports on their laptops, especially the gaming models. And the ports on the LOQ 15IRH8 aren't any different. Great job, Lenovo. Another thing I'd like to point out is how well ventilated the entire laptop is. We'll get the temperatures later, but just know that this laptop will be able to intake and push out a lot of air through its bottom, side, and rear vents. I do have some qualms about these painted heatsinks though, but it doesn't noticeably affect cooling performance, so I let it pass for this review. Would have been much more baller to see copper in these though. Orange and blue is such a nice combo. Before we get to the display, let's talk about this webcam first. It's a pretty solid 1080p performer, and if you rewatch my unboxing of this laptop, you would remember that I was very impressed with how clear and how vibrant the image was. And it's not a fluke, it really has a great performing camera. Clear voice and clear video for meetings, classes, Zoom calls, and even basic content creation. One downside though is that it doesn't come with IR sensors, so there's no facial recognition login. But it wins out on one feature. It has a hardware disconnect toggle, meaning there's a little toggle here at the side of the laptop that if you flick it on, it's going to disconnect the webcam and the mics from the entire circuitry of the laptop. So it's as if your laptop doesn't have a webcam or a mic, so hackers and bad actors can't stealthily monitor you from afar. Let's get to the display. And this is probably the best part of this laptop, not just for its performance, but it's also one of the more customizable parts that you can select on the Lenovo website when ordering the LOQ 15IRH8. You can kit it out with a 1080p 60Hz panel if you're on a tight budget, but you can also have this, a 16:9 aspect ratio 2560 by 1440p 165Hz LCD panel that has a 3 millisecond response time and can go up to 350 nits of brightness. It does 100% sRGB and supports NVIDIA G-Sync. A significant feature of this panel not seen on other laptops is its dual mode, where it can run at the full 165Hz 3 millisecond mode or a lower power 83Hz mode with a 5 millisecond response time. Yep, no baseline 60Hz with this model, so you're still good to game even in low power mode. It's responsive and bright enough for most media consumption in gaming scenarios, although it has to be said that it doesn't lend itself much to hyper-competitive esports titles because of its substandard response times. But it still gets the job done. It's a pretty solid choice, one that I would recommend if you're speccing out the laptop from their site, especially if you're getting the RTX 4060 version. The 4060 laptop is a good performer, putting up slightly better performance than the previous gen RTX 3060, but with a bigger 8GB VRAM and, more importantly, support for frame generation. This extends the capability of the card from being a strictly 1080p performer to reach up to the slightly harder to drive 1440p standard. Lenovo shows that they really know and want to serve their market properly with the available selections of displays on the LOQ 15IRH8. The simple fact that the low power mode of this 1440p screen is set to 83Hz and not 60Hz speaks a lot about how much gaming Lenovo wants you to do on this device. Unfortunately, my good praises for the display can't carry over to the speakers. They're the big letdown for me for this laptop. It may just be me, but I usually expect big laptops to sound big. But the speaker presence is just not here. Don't get me wrong, it's a well-balanced and well-EQ'd output, but it lacks a lot in volume, and I found myself sliding the volume to higher registers even when listening to music at reasonably quiet locations like the office. Previously, the Legion Pro 7i was able to sit at a comfortable 30% volume at the same location. The LOQ 15IRH8 only manages to match that at 60% volume. Have a listen to it here. Yeah, it's pretty weak. You're going to have to give the speaker a bit more beans, Lenovo. Alright, we're done with the outside. Let's head on over to the insides of the Lenovo LOQ 15IRH8. The unit with me is running the 13th Gen Intel Core i7-13620H, which has 6 performance cores that can boost up to 4.9 GHz and 4 efficiency cores that can go up to 3.6 GHz. It's got 16 gigs of DDR5 5200 megatransfers per second RAM, the NVIDIA RTX 4060 laptop GPU with 8 gigs of GDDR6 VRAM, and 512 gigs of M.2 PCIe 4 NVMe QLC storage. This is one of the more souped-up configurations of the LOQ 15IRH8 that you can get. The maxed-out version can be upgraded further with an i7-13700H processor and a 1TB M.2 TLC drive. I think this is a great configuration for a mid-to-high gaming laptop. The i7-13620H is just the right power for an RTX 4060 to drive AAA games at 1440p resolution, and 16 gigs of DDR5 RAM is pretty okay for gaming. It can even cover medium-weight content creation and editing, given that you're not editing huge 4K files. But then again, you can just bump that up to 24 gig or even 32 gig if you're ever needing. The only big letdown is the 512 gig M.2 storage. It's just not big enough for modern games. Better get the 1TB if you're configuring yours, or better yet, get a 2TB because as we're going to see in this internal shot, there is only one available slot for the NVMe drive. So if you're going to expand in the future, you're going to have to clone your drive instead of just adding another M.2 in there. And while we're here, we can point out the 2 blower-style fans, the 3 heat pipes, the 58.5 watt-hour battery which looks like it can be expanded since it's got space for something bigger, and the 2 RAM slots that allow the laptop to be expanded with up to 64 gigs of memory. It loses some points because of the singular M.2 slot, but it gains some points by not having soldered RAM and having 2 slots. Evens out, I guess. Alright, it's that time. Numbers on the screen. This is the last laptop review that's going to be done in this format of performance tests. The next laptop reviews coming in 2024 will see some improvements to the game selection and data presentation. But for now, here's how the Lenovo LOQ 15IRH8 fared in my performance tests. Starting off with Cinebench R23, the i7-13620H fared really well in both tests, scoring 12,524 points in multi-core and 1,798 points in single-core. Great upper-tier performance. On 3D Mark Time Spy, we see it slightly fall down the charts, scoring 10,545 points in GPU and 9,478 points in CPU, garnering an overall score of 10,369 points. It's not a bad score, but since we're running off of a stock power handling preset and just a 170 watt power brick, it becomes very obvious through its score that the system will prioritize feeding power to the RTX 4060 over the i7 just to keep its frames up. Moving on over to gaming benchmarks, we see the LOQ 15IRH8 muster up some good frames in our test titles. First on the list is Returnal on epic settings with DLSS set to off. It dominated the roguelike, averaging 105 FPS with a 1% low of 65 FPS, entirely playable. And then again, that's without DLSS. Moving on over to Dirt 5 Ultra settings with ray tracing on, we see the laptop hit its 170 watt power limit, averaging 60 FPS with a 1% low of 45 FPS. That's rough, and during my playtime I mostly stuck to high settings without any ray tracing. The same results can be seen in our second racing title, Forza Horizon 5, all max settings without DLSS, where it averaged 64 FPS with a 1% low of 60 FPS. This is kind of weird, as we're seeing how the 170 watt power limit really acts as a brick wall to the frame rates. During my playtime, I turned on DLSS and frame generation to get my gameplay at around 100 FPS average. Battlefield 2042 Ultra settings DLSS off is up next, and we see the same story with an average of 69 FPS and a 1% low of 62 FPS. Again, DLSS saves this title as using it on auto immediately lets the game average at around 97 FPS. Last up, we have Cyberpunk 2077 Update 2.1 on Ultra settings RTX off and DLSS off, averaging at 53 FPS with a 1% low of 38 FPS. This one hits that CPU and GPU hard, but then again, frame generation and DLSS swoops in to save the day to get it to average around 70 FPS in balanced mode. It's very apparent that the 170 watt power limit of the LOQ 15IRH8 holds it back a lot. It's super noticeable in our heavier titles like Dirt 5, Battlefield 2042, and Cyberpunk 2077. But do also keep in mind that they were tested at ultra settings without any DLSS or frame generation. You might want to fine-tune some of those settings yourself to get the frame rates that you want. I promise you, you don't have to change much. If you do want to see how the laptop performed in all other presets, head on over to the playlist section of my YouTube channel and check out the performance tests playlist for the entries of the Lenovo LOQ 15IRH8. And of course, right before we go to verdict, we have to talk about battery life and thermals. And I've got to hand it to Lenovo. Even though we saw earlier in the teardown photo that there's still more space inside the body of the LOQ 15IRH8 for a bigger battery than its current 58.5 watt-hour one, it's not a lightweight. Light usage allowed me to run the laptop at 5 hours and 24 minutes before it shut off. In gaming on performance mode with the screen set to 165Hz, it was able to run Dirt 5 for an hour and 21 minutes. That is not bad. It's a hardy laptop, that's for sure. Before we move to thermal readouts, here's the fan noise test of the LOQ 15IRH8, moving from using 0 fans to maximum RPM. Yeah, those twin blowers sound really loud, and the only comparable laptop that I have ever used in terms of fan sound volume is the ROG Zephyrus Duo. It's an okay thing, I guess, because to me it just means that the fan is moving enough air to keep everything cool. But still, the Zephyrus Duo was running way hotter and denser hardware than this laptop, so yeah, Lenovo, you might want to tune the fan curve on these a bit further. Lastly, let's talk temperatures. The LOQ 15IRH8 idles at around 38 and 35 degrees on the CPU and GPU respectively, while on full load in Cyberpunk 2077 I was able to peak out the temps to 95 degrees and 79 degrees in CPU and GPU respectively. Yikes! That i7 does get really toasty. It's kind of like a signature of the 13th gen, but at least it's not usually sustained that high. That RTX 4060 fared way better. The cooling on the LOQ 15IRH8 can usually rein things back to around 87 degrees average. Overall, it's not bad. It's not super good, but it's manageable. The mid-range gaming laptop space has always been the biggest battlefield amongst gaming laptop brands, and I can see that the LOQ 15IRH8 will be squaring off against two mainstays of the segment. They're both big names here locally and internationally, the Asus TUF F15 and the Acer Nitro 16. While some configurations of the LOQ 15IRH8 might lose out to some of those models, it's not hard to configure one to beat it at their respective price points, nor receive a laptop that is as well built and as feature-rich as the LOQ 15IRH8. You do have to contend with a few minor problems like the lackluster speakers and the fan noise, but for the most part, you're getting a solid performer at a great mid-range price. If you're set on the specs of your new laptop, take a look at the configuration options for the Lenovo LOQ 15IRH8. You just might find exactly what you're looking for. So that's the Lenovo LOQ 15IRH8. Do you have any questions about it? Please leave them down in a comment. As always, please like and subscribe, check out my other videos, and stay tuned to the channel for more tech and tech-adjacent content. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.